Welcome, everyone. I am Gloria Blackwell, AAUW's Chief Executive Officer, and I want to welcome you to our latest alumni conversation regarding the book, Wild Girls, How the Outdoors Shaped Women Who Challenged a Nation, with Dr. Tiya Miles. Just a few housekeeping issues. The program is being recorded, and it will be available on AAUW's website probably next week, so you don't have to be in a frenzy to take notes. Everyone during the webinar will be on mute, and definitely, use the chat box for anything that you want to add, or any positive feedback you'd like to give us. I want to thank all of you who pre-submitted questions. We got some really great questions, and we have tried to make sure that we engage them, within the conversation today. But if time does permit, we may actually be able to get to the question box. So I am really pleased to introduce AAUW Community Action Grant alumna, Dr. Tiya Miles. She is an author, the Michael Garvey Professor of History, and Radcliffe Alumni Professor at Harvard University, and also the Director of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard as well. Welcome, Dr. Miles.
Thank you so much.
She is the author of multiple books, including many, many prize-winning histories about race and slavery in the American past. They include All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake, which is a New York Times bestseller that won 11 historical and literary prizes, including the 2021 National Book Award for Nonfiction and the 2022 Kundo History Prize. It was also named the Best Book of the Year by the New York Times, Washington Post, and more. She has multiple other acclaimed scholarly works, including The Dawn of Detroit, Tales from the Haunted South, The House on Diamond Hill, A Cherokee Plantation Story, and The Ties That Bind. And among many others, her work has been supported by the MacArthur Foundation, Fellowship, Mellon Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. But today, I'm very excited to discuss her book, Wild Girls, How the Outdoors Shaped Women Who Challenged a Nation. So, Dr. Miles, let's get right to it. Are you ready?
Let's jump in. I'm ready.
All right. So, you were awarded a community action grant from AAUW to help fund Echo Girls, which was an environmental and cultural opportunities program for urban girls in Southeast Michigan. Can you tell us just a bit about that project and how the award impacted the program and your research during that time?
I can do that. I'd be happy to do that. But first, I just need to offer a bit of an update to my bio so everybody knows that I'm no longer the director of the Charles Warren Center. My term for that is just ending.
Oh,
The current director is Dr. Evelyn Humans, who is a good friend and also a wonderful scholar.
thank you for that update.
Absolutely. So Eco Girls, that was a project that I developed several years ago. And I want to say, right as we began, that AAUW is the only organization that has supported me in all of my unusual, risky, sort of, to the sidelines of my typical academic work projects, because AAUW supported Eco Girls, and also my novel, The Cherokee Rose, when that came out, I got to have one conversation with members just like this, and it was just really wonderful. It felt like a big hug from AAUW for these projects that they are unusual, so they always feel like walking out on a limb when I have attempted them. It's just great to feel that if you walk out on a limb, that there's someone there to catch you. So Eco Girls is a project that came to mind for me several years ago when I was experiencing a number of things at once. One of those things was I was a mother with fairly young children. Another is that I was just coming to realize the extent of the environmental risk and damage and threat that we were all facing in our communities. And I was coming to realize that in part through conversations with colleagues, like Dr. Dorceta Taylor, who's an environmental sociologist. I was coming to know that through having the chance to tour Detroit. I took this tour called Toxic Tour of Detroit, where we were taken to various areas that were abandoned brownfields that corporations had to left, that were yards full of waste and just refuse from automobile companies, where the incinerator had been built and was polluting the air and affecting children and causing higher rates of asthma, but also where people were developing a number of community and neighborhood farms, and where they were developing farmers markets and trying to use that land and to repurpose that land in a way that was loving of one another and bringing a degree of resourcefulness to the challenging life situations that people were facing. So I started to see Michigan, which was my home state at the time, where I was living and working and raising my children, in a different light. It was a place that was damaged because of environmental racism and environmental injustice. And it was a place where people were also coming together to see what it was they could do to make an improvement in the community around the environment. And so all these different elements mixed together with a sabbatical that I happen to be on. Those times that we have to sit and think can be wonderfully inspiring. And I thought then, what could I do? I mean, I'm not actually going to be somebody who can create a farm in my backyard. I mean, I'm a gardener, but I'm not particularly skilled at it. So I thought, what can I do? And I thought, okay, one of the things that I do hopefully pretty well is that I teach. And so as the mother of twin girls at the time, who were very young, in grade school, I thought, okay, I can combine my love of teaching, my skill in teaching, with my knowledge of what it's like to raise girls, with my newly developing knowledge about environmental issues, into a program. And that program was Eco Girls, which stood for Environmental and Cultural Opportunities for Girls. And it was situated in urban Southeast Michigan. And I was able to get some other wonderful people to join in with me, especially staff members and students from the Department of African American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, to form a program where we would have weekend activities for girls in the area, in the neighboring cities, and also a summer camp where we would introduce them to environmental stories and leaders, and teach them how to make things like building a solar oven. We had a summer camp up in northern Michigan on one of the lakes, where the university actually had a whole setup, so sort of a smaller satellite campus with a dorm. We took the kids up there, and the people who really were doing the day-to-day on the ground work with these girls were not only me as faculty and staff members from our Department of AFRM, but also these incredible undergraduate and graduate students in the university. So we had students who were coming from various places, from environmental studies, from Black studies, from women's studies, and dedicating their time to do this work with the younger kids. And of course, all that takes funding. You got to have some money to put forward to be able to not only rent some of the spaces and to get hold of the supplies that you need, but also to support people, because the students who were involved were would have been happy to volunteer. But I'm the kind of person who thinks, look, let's either get you credit or get you paid for what it is that you're doing here. And so AAUW was one of our very first supporters of the program. And that support helped to legitimize the program in terms of what people at our university thought of it. And we were able to then get more funding, for example, from our School of Education at Michigan.
That's really great. And I recall, you getting that award, and just thinking about how there really is sort of that that lack of information and engagement and opportunity, right, for urban girls to
Mhm.
have those kind of experiences and, the value that they were able to get from, having that experience. And I'm, just excited that AAW was able to support you in that, given the generous support of AAW members for our community action grants. Um,
Yes, and may I just add something, Gloria, just
sure.
responding to what you said? So I think it's really important. What you pointed out about opportunity is key. And
Yeah.
one opportunity that we were able to open up for the girls in the program, and there were some boys too, because there were some younger brothers who tagged along, was to give them access to spaces and people at the university. So they
Mhm.
were coming into the department, they were spending time with faculty, they were hearing presentations from faculty. They were learning all kinds of things, such as um, nature terms, animal, plant, tree terms in Anishinaabe, so in the Ojibwe language, which was really important in terms of helping them to know where they were. This was indigenous land in the past, it's a native place in the present, and helping them to be able to understand themselves in that context. Many of the girls in our program, most of them actually came from Detroit. Many of them had not ever been to northern Michigan. They had never seen those northern lakes. And being able to take them there and to say, this is your home too, this is a part of your place, was just really powerful. And another thing that was important in this experience, besides the opportunity for them to discover new things about their state and to learn from people on the university campus, was encouraging the girls to see their own home place as a place where nature was everywhere and where nature was beautiful and flourishing, and encouraging them to claim that space. So one thing I remember so powerfully is when we took the kids to the Detroit River. And for many of them, this is their hometown, right? They walked by that river or they rode by that river all the time. But taking them to that river and sitting down with them on the ground at Belle Isle Park and telling stories about the river helped them to sort of claim this space as theirs, as a part of their life, and as special, as connected to stories about their community history. And I will never forget the way their faces just opened like sunflowers when they realized that they live in a place that is so significant to US history, that is so important to the ways in which enslaved people were able to free themselves. I mean, for me, I'm thinking of it right now as I describe it to you, Gloria, and to everybody in the Zoom space, because to me, it's one of those times when, as a teacher, you know what you're doing it for. You feel it in your heart and you know what you're doing it for.
Yeah. I love that. And I can, when you say, thinking about their faces just opening up and looking like sunflowers, and knowing that that experience may have had an impact on them that lived far beyond, right? Far beyond
Yeah.
that experience that they had with Eco
Mhm.
Girls. So thank you for providing them, and everyone that you worked with, for providing them with that opportunity. So how did your work with Eco Girls, with that program, influence your work and your research for Wild Girls? Or was it the
Mhm.
reverse? Did your early interest sort of on the effect of nature and outdoor spaces on Black women, such as Harriet Tubman, spark the idea to create the program?
Well, the program was sparked really by my awareness of some of the problems and challenges in the place where I lived, and my desire to do something, kind of small to help that. But it is definitely the case that for me, what was the newfound knowledge about Harriet Tubman's ecological consciousness was a part of that whole mix. So I mentioned earlier that Dr. Dorceta Taylor was a colleague who I would speak with. We shared a department in common, Black Studies. And she's the first one who ever mentioned to me that Harriet Tubman had to have been an environmentalist because she needed that knowledge to navigate the woods to freedom. Dr. Taylor told me that in the context of her work on natural resources and environments, which was connected to that moment for me of developing Eco Girl. So I'm actually really glad you asked the question that way, because you're helping me to see that it really was kind of a circular relationship. I tend to think of it as Eco Girls Sparked Wild Girls, the book, which it did, and I'll talk about that. But Harriet Tubman was an important figure who did help to spark Eco Girls as a project. So it's all kind of coming around in this beautiful spherical way. The way in which Eco Girls fed into Wild Girls was back when I was working on that project with many terrific colleagues. We were not producing scholarship about the program or about the activities, about our pedagogy. We were really in it to do it. We were in it trying to figure out how can we best help build up these kids, build up these girls, help them to see who they are and what they have in themselves and in their environments and their communities. And we weren't really trying to publish articles about it. Instead, we did create a pretty in-depth website, which is still up as environmentforgirls.org. And in that website, we try to include information that could be shared among the parents and the kids at the time, but that also could be a resource for people later on who might want to just look into, so how do you start a girls group? How do you start an environmental club? What are some of the ways that you get funding sources? What are some of the stipulations that must be met? And so on. So we put a lot of our collective thinking in that website. And people who go to that website will see a lot of my writing, though my name was not on it, but when I describe, this was the philosophy behind Eco Girls, and so on. But that's, of course, very different than publishing an article or publishing a book. And I had no intention at the time of doing that with Eco Girls. It was a community project. And it was there to help kids and to help their families to broaden their opportunities and to broaden their experiences. But what happened was during really the height of COVID, I received an invitation from an editor at W.W. Norton at the press. Her name is Elaine Mason. And the invitation was, would I like to write a small book on a big idea for their series, which was titled Norton Shorts. And their series was intended to be a marker and a celebration of their 100th birthday. And as the series title indicates, and as her invitation made very clear, this needed to be a short book. They wanted it to, I think their tagline is brilliance with brevity. So it had to be a short book. The invitation came my way. I could write on anything that I wanted to. And Eco Girls was a project that had generated a lot of ideas and thinking for me, some creative writing for me, but I had never published on it. And here we were in the height of the pandemic, Gloria, and I was at home with my kids, as many people were. We were doing the online Zoom school, which felt kind of like homeschooling. I was also teaching my classes by Zoom. And at that time, it was very, very apparent how important the outdoors was. I mean, being able to go outside was our family's sanity. The fact that we were privileged enough, fortunate enough to have a yard with these beautiful old growth trees, to have a garden, which not a professional garden, I admitted that earlier, but it had some beautiful flowers and some color. It made our lives so much better during the pandemic. And so the invitation came my way. And from these different inputs, I thought the outdoors is critically important. I'm seeing it in my own life right now. I used to run a program for girls that got them outside. How about writing about that for this book? And at first, I didn't know what form it would take. I mean, would it be a book about Eco Girls, specifically about the program? Or would it be a book that was more kind of in line with and more in keeping with my own academic writing, which tends to be historical? And thinking about it, here's that circle again. What I came up with, or really what came to me, what surfaced for me, was Harriet Tubman. And thinking about what the book would be, and having all those little points of inspiration, Harriet Tubman is the figure who surfaced. And I thought, what about writing a book about girls outdoors in the 19th century? And starting with Harriet Tubman as sort of my spark or my anchor, and going back into her life in a little more depth, and trying to see if I could come up with, kind of a thesis or a theory about these girls. So that's where I started. It was with Tubman. I went back and reread some of the primary sourcing about her, and I saw that there really was an argument available to me in the primary sources about Tubman. And that argument was about how spending significant time outdoors made Harriet Tubman into the woman she would become. It was her girlhood outside, even in exploitative circumstances, and they certainly were that tested her and shaped her and allowed her to see possibilities around the bend, that taught her about the natural world, and that prepared her for later escaping herself and helping others to escape. And so that was the point of germination for the book. Once I saw that for Harriet Tubman, I thought, okay, who else can I see this about?
That's really great. And I'm thinking all the way back to when you said about your colleague and talking about Harriet Tubman as an environmentalist, right? You think about the fact that for the most part, people just assume that she was able to navigate all of this terrain and all of these spaces and did all of those things that she did over, multiple years. But how was that possible without having the skills and the affinity to make that happen? And it is an area that you actually never really heard discussed before. So
That's exactly it. I mean,
absolutely not.
the
Yeah,
how is
yeah.
something that we really haven't spent as much time with. And once I started thinking about the how with Tubman and thought I saw an answer to the how, I went back to some of my other um, historical subjects that I had thought about and maybe taught about, and I'd be happy to talk more about that if you'd like in a while, and kind of applied the same question to develop the book.
Absolutely. And so, in Wild Girls, you discuss the very ways in which women of different races engaged with nature. So how did the experiences of Indigenous and African American women sort of differ from those of Euro American women? And, you know, what did those differences reveal about that intersection of race, culture, and environmental interaction? Because that
Mhm.
really is the key piece.
Right. So the structure of Wild Girls and the focus and subject matter, once I had the Harriet Tubman piece in place, really did come from my teaching and research I had been doing over a number of years. So with Harriet Tubman, I had been keeping a file on her because I was so intrigued by her and her relationship to the environment, and that file was kind of ready and waiting for me when I decided to work on the book. But in addition to that, I had been keeping a file on any material I could find having to do with Black people, especially enslaved Black women, and the environment. So when I would read a slave narrative for another book I was working on, I would actually just keep a second notebook and write down moments, examples of when they were talking about the natural world. I also did that with WPA interviews, Work Progress Administration interviews with formerly enslaved people that are available online, and had file on that. I also have regularly taught a course on Native American women and for Indigenous women, Indigenous girls, the environment and the natural worlds in very particular ways, which are place-based and nation-based uh, and are not the woo-woo spirituality romanticized view that people kind of wrongly place onto Native Americans, but in very particular ways, Indigenous women and girls felt nature to be important to who they were and their people. And I have been teaching about that. I just see I see a comment in the chat that the sound is becoming garbled. I hope that corrects itself. I'm gonna assume and hope that it does and just keep talking. And if you still have sound problems, please let us know and we'll see if I can adjust anything.
Thank you. I think part of it is to try to maybe keep still, and that'll make it not be as.
Oh, I talk too much with my hands. I can do that. Okay, I will try to tone that down. So in my American women's history classes, place and elements of the natural physical world were always very important. And so I had my lecture notes and class notes and research for those classes that were available to me as well. And so a lot of the book is shaped around those two populations, Black women and Native women. There are white women in the book too, and there are Asian American women and Chicanas toward the end of the book. Those groups are not the focal points of many of my classes, but I did have material on them for research for articles in the past. And I will say that one woman who became very important in Waters, Louisa May Alcott, she came into view in a very surprising way. And this again goes back to COVID. My family and I were cooped up in the house, as I mentioned earlier. And one weekend, I was fooling around and I saw that it was, I think, National Ice Cream Day or something. It was just an excuse or reason to get out somewhere. And so I told my family, okay, we're going to go to Concord, Massachusetts for National Ice Cream Day. We're going to get some ice cream. And we'll go to Orchard House, which is the Alcott family store site. Where Louisa May Alcott, spent many years of life. And Richard. So we went to Orchard House. We got some ice cream and everything's closed because of COVID, so we could only be outside. So my kids and I, my husband was there too, but he wasn't as adventurous as we were. The kids and I spent a lot of time just walking around the grounds of Orchard House and the neighboring woods. And we also noticed that the historic site keeps a garden. It's a garden inspired by the Alcott family and the things they'd grown. So that garden was still marked with the things that they would have had in it. And I read the historic marker about Alcott, and I thought to myself, oh, this is interesting. There's Walden Pond, just the trees, there's the woods, here's a garden. I've now decided that I'm gonna be working on this book on girls outdoors in the 19th century. How about Louisa May Alcott? And I had read Little Women a long time ago when I was in high school, and I decided I'm gonna reread this novel. I reread the novel, I started doing some research on Alcott, and I realized that my Tubman thesis fit Alcott's life as well. And so Alcott becomes one of the women who is a key figure in the book through that experience and through doing some new, fresh research on materials that are held here on my campus. Her papers are here on my campus, for example. So those are the major groups that I look at in the book. And you're right, Gloria, it was a challenge to try to talk about these groups across the book in relation to the outdoors and nature when they all figure into the popular imagination or the national imagination in different ways when it comes to nature. I mean, it was kind of like writing about apples and oranges and bananas and thinking about these girls outside and what being outside meant to them and how it shaped them, because these different groups were viewed as being linked or connected to the outdoors in different and even contrasting ways. So let me try to see if I can lay that out. I think when it comes to Black enslaved girls, and of course some Black girls were free at this time, but the majority were enslaved. The idea of those girls in nature is really one of exploitation. It's about being forced to work outside in terrible conditions and not having a choice about whether or not you're outdoors or indoors and the kind of work that you do. That narrative about Black girls and women and people outdoors does change over time, but it is still a very narrow narrative, which tends to see Black people as being oppressed laborers in the fields in the South, and then Black people as being service workers, industrial workers in the North with no access to nature because cities aren't viewed as being other places, even though they are. So these are ideas about Black people, Black women, and Black girls that city relationship to nature, which is negative, exploitative, violent, and punitive. Writing into that was a challenge in and of itself. Trying to write about how, yes, that is the case, but there is so much more. And trying to show how Harriet Tubman is somebody who was abused by being forced to work outside, but also found herself outside, found her strength outside. It was very challenging. But then added on to that was the whole Native American story and the ways in which Native girls and women had a different kind of relationship to nature and were stereotyped in different ways than Black women with regard to nature. So Native girls and women were in the US imagination often viewed as representing a romanticized nature. So when I say this, the first picture that comes to my mind is the image of the kind of stereotypical Native, princess figure on the Land O'Lakes margarine and butter advertising and packaging. So you all probably remember that. I mean, now they've updated it, thank goodness. But that was the image of this beautiful, young Indigenous woman, would have been referred to as Indian woman, in a natural environment surrounded by the lakes and the trees and looking like she is open and accessible and available to anybody who wants to kind of purchase her when it comes to this packaging. But in the American national narrative, to anybody who wants to come in and settle on her lands. So this is kind of the Pocahontas image. This is the image. This is the notion that Native women are deeply connected to nature in a romanticized way, in an idealized way, and that their presence in nature and their welcoming attitude is sort of like a come on in sign to anybody who wants to take their land. So Black women in nature were viewed as being exploited, Native women were viewed as being romanticized, and white women in nature, a totally different kind of story, which is that they were often represented as people, middle class white girls, and again, we're talking about the 19th century, as individuals who shouldn't be out in nature. Instead, white girls in this kind of middle-class Victorian cultural idea were supposed to be inside. They were supposed to be in the home. They were supposed to be in the parlor, taking care of families, embroidering and sewing and doing all kinds of domestic things. If they were outside, girls or white girls in this class context were expected to be very close to the home. So they could be out in the kitchen garden, going back to that orchard house, Alcott garden that I mentioned earlier, but they weren't supposed to be venturing out into the hills, into the fields, going out into the waterways. They weren't supposed to be doing hard or heavy labor in the hot sun. They weren't supposed to be sexualized in relation to nature in the ways that Native American Indigenous girls and women were. So really different original narratives about these groups that I was trying to see in a different way outdoors. It's in Wild Girls, I tried to show the context in which these girls lived in a way that points to the stereotype or to the narrative, but doesn't reproduce it. And I tried to show how these girls were outside in a way that changed their lives, but had different positioning outside. So Harriet Tubman and enslaved girl outside, it's gonna be a very, very, very different set of circumstances than Louisa May Alcott, a self-identified abolitionist free girl outside. And then Laura Smith happened. She was another white girl I brought into the story who was an abolitionist and a railroad activist, very, very brave in what she did. But who was white and who was free and who was able to be outdoors in a way that was free of the kind of heavy exploitation and fear that somebody like Tubman would have found outdoors. So there was a lot to balance and a lot to try to, I guess, caveat in the book in a way that wasn't going to be too onerous or burdensome because the book was supposed to be short. And we also had in mind, my editors and me, that this could be a book, that Wild Girls could be a book that could be assigned in an undergraduate classroom and even in a high school classroom. And so while I wanted to get into that complexity, I wanted to try to do it in a way that was probably less in depth than I'm talking about it right now, so that it could be readable and it could be assignable for younger readers.
I love that explanation, and we can only imagine the research that you had to undertake, right? And how challenging it was when you think about how it helped you to unearth whether it was a version of being exploited or being, romanticized or clearly being cherished, right? How that intersectional piece, came together. So when you think about that work also, sort of how do mentorship and community support contribute to the achievements of the women, right, that you elevate in Wild Girls. Are there examples of, were there key figures or groups that really played a significant role in their journeys?
This is one of the findings in the book that I don't think it's front and center. I don't know that I really highlighted it in this book. I did write another book that just came out in June about Harriet Tubman, which is focused only on her. It's called Night Flyer. And in that book, I really foregrounded this point that you just made, Gloria, about how we're not talking about a lone figure, a lone person or a lone hero. We're talking about somebody who was made by her community. But that was definitely also the case for the figures that I talk about in Mean Girls. And I mean, those influences sometimes were pushing the girls and shaping the girls in positive ways, encouraging them to go in a certain direction. But sometimes influences were actually negative inspiration. By that, I mean people saying, you can't, right? You can't achieve this. You can't accomplish this. You can't be here. And then those girls looking around and saying, well, wait a minute, maybe I can. And yes, I will. And so people around them heavily influenced them. In the case of Harriet Tubman, the first people around her were her family members. She adored her parents. She loved her siblings, and they were people models for her. One example is her mother, Rit Green, Harriet Green, nicknamed Rit, who ran away at some point because she knew that one of her sons, Moses, was about to be sold. So she ran away with him. This is Harriet Tubman's mother, into the woods and stayed there for weeks, trying to wait her owner out, trying to really force his hand. And so in the end, he didn't sell her child because she was able to go out in nature, go out into the swamps and the woods and to survive and basically say to the man who owned her, oh, really? You want to try to sell my child? We'll see if you can get a hold of him or me. Rit Green did that outside. And although I don't have a document that says it, I am certain that Harriet Tubman saw the example of her mother and learned and grew inside herself and added this strategy to the toolkit that she would actually develop over time. the strategy of you can survive in the woods. You can even survive in the woods with somebody else who's going to be dependent on you, and who might be weaker than you, and who might not know the way, such as you do. And you can force the hands of enslavers by doing this. So for Tubman, we have so many examples. Her father was such an important teacher for her. And there were men who she worked with in the woods who were important teachers for her. We don't know about Indigenous teachers for Harriet Tubman, but I am sure that they would have existed in the area where she grew up, on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. And she's just one figure. Alcott, who I've already spoken about, she grew up in a household where her parents, particularly her mother, were really concerned about her desire to be out on the streets and to go out and to explore. And at one point, Alcott's mother apparently tied her to the sofa in the parlor to keep her from running away. Because Louisa May Alcott would, as a very small girl growing up in Boston at this time, would leave the house and just walk. She'd be gone for hours. Her parents and community would be panicking until they found her. So her mother, according to a story that Alcott told, her mother, Alba Alcott, tied her to a sofa. Now, I think that might have been a negative push for Alcott. That might have been, in addition to the very feminine clothing that her mother dressed her in that she hated, an indication of, this is what I want to get away from. Now, a little footnote to this, which I think is also interesting, is that when the Alcott family moved from Boston out to the countryside of Concord, Mass, Louisa May Alcott was just she was just ready. She really wanted to get outside and to run and to explore. And at that point in that place, her mother met her. Her mother gave her permission to do that. And I don't know if that's because the environment seemed safer to her mother, or if it's because Louisa had been pushing for change. And her mother changed her parenting style in reaction to that. But she finally did give her mother's permission to explore outside. And when she was out there, she was actually spending time with some of these very famous transcendentalists in the area. So Thoreau, Emerson, these were older men who Alcott actually hung out with. So, I mean, she hung out on Walden Pond with Henry David Thoreau. So he certainly was an influence on her thinking and on her later writing. And later on in the book, I devote a chapter to an Indigenous girls basketball team in central Montana. This was at the Fort Shaw Federal Boarding School for Native American youth. This was a part of that whole national push to kind of forcibly or coercively educate and assimilate Native people. And there were a number of girls in that school who were coming from reservations in Montana and Idaho. And when they were there, they were taking classes in sports. And this was actually new for girls and women at the time. We were talking about the 1890s into the early 1900s. And they ended up forming a basketball team at Fort Shaw. And this was a team that became a championship team that went to the 1904 World's Fair. I want to see if I can show you all something. If I can take it out of my book here. I hope you can see this. I'm just going to try to put it on the screen. This is a postcard. Maybe you can see the image a little bit there. This is a postcard that I found on eBay. And this is kind of a little research habit of mine that maybe some other folks in the Zoom space do too. When I'm working on a project, I always get on eBay and see if I can find something unusual related to it. I have found old letters in that way. And this is a postcard that was written to one of the girls who played on that Fort Shaw Indigenous girls basketball team back in, around 1900. Her name was Maddie Hayes. On the back of the postcard, y'all probably can't see it, but it's addressed to Maddie Hayes, Fort Shaw, Montana. Love this eBay find, love it. And I keep this as a bookmark in my copy of Wild Girls to remind me not only about these individual girls who came from the various reservations to join this team, and for whom this team was kind of a lifesaver because it brought them together, it gave them a sense of community, but also to remind me that these girls had community members back home. So they had their team and they had one another on the Fort Shaw campus. And they also had their families and their tribal members, back home on the reservations who were thinking of them and pulling for them and sending them cards and reminding them and encouraging them to pursue their studies and to try to take what was in many cases and could be a negative kind of punitive schooling experience and to turn it around to benefit them and to benefit their community members. In this chapter about the Fort Shaw team, I write a lot about both these elements, about what it was like to be on this campus when these girls, as far as I could see in the records for this school, they didn't want to go. They were often, kind of made to go by their parents who were convinced by representatives of the school or who were convinced by the Indian agent is what these representatives were called, the federal government, to send their kids away. So these girls didn't want to be there. They were homesick. They were desperate, but they came together to form a basketball team. They were led by another young woman, a teenage girl named Josephine Langley. And Josephine Langley, she was an assistant teacher, an assistant coach who was hired on the Fort Shaw. She was a Blackfeet young woman. She was barely a woman herself. I mean, she was about, 15 when she came up to that. She brought basketball to these girls at Fort Shaw. She had picked up the sport at Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. And she said to these girls, basically, come on, we're going to play. And here's an example of what I said earlier, Gloria, about how I think sometimes the push was from a negative influence. When Jo Langley said that she wanted to teach these girls at Fort Shaw how to play basketball, she went to the superintendent of Fort Shaw School and she asked for equipment to be able to teach the girls to play. And this is not going to be a surprise probably to anybody. Of course he said, we don't have the money, we don't have the budget, we don't have the equipment. And Josephine Langley took that no and turned it around into a yes by basically saying, okay, we'll use the boys' equipment. We'll practice out on the lawn, we'll practice out on the field. So she made a team without the initial support of her school, without funding, without basketballs even. And that team became so popular, so successful. They beat every other team in the state of Montana. They became the glory of the school, such that the superintendent decided that he was going to be the coach. He took on the name of the coach. And their team was invited to play in the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, where they earned the title of champions of the world. So yes, this was definitely a community endeavor, a family endeavor. In these cases of the various girls that I talk about, it was other people helping to either build them up or to kind of almost dare them to succeed by telling them you can't.
I love that. Just the three very powerful examples in three very different ways, right? Whether you're talking about the indigenous women or the African American or the white women. And, I'm thinking, what is the message or what is the takeaway, right? That you hope those who, read Wild Girls, what do you hope that they gain? And, what is the impact that you hope that this will have on really encouraging the creation of these kind of, broader learning and educational spaces and programs that really help young women and girls to engage more broadly with and learn sort of from natural spaces and to step outside of
Mhm.
what might be considered, you know, where they should be.
Well, I love that question, Gloria, because it really captures my intentions for this book, which sprung out of my intentions for Eco Girls. And that is that whatever I have done and done in collaboration with others' input and their help and support is meant to actually be applied to something. It's meant to be a resource and an inspiration and information for people to go out and do something with it. And so one thing that I'd love people to take away from Wild Girls is every girl and young woman and woman in that book is somebody who was living in a time which felt like everything was, if not falling apart, then an extreme challenge. So this was a time when Black people were enslaved and fighting for their freedom. Indigenous people were facing forced removal and being placed on reservations and facing coerced schooling, losing their land, facing extreme challenges to their national peoplehood. And white girls and women and white families were also facing a stricter gendered bifurcation of the way it was that they can move about in the world. So the Victorian era was much more stringent around what girls could or couldn't do than the 18th century before that. And so they were all of these different communities facing extreme circumstances, which stretched from, is your life and land and peoplehood going to be taken away from you? Is your liberty going to be taken away from you? Are you going to have less freedom of choice in your own life situation, a family situation? And to me, that is very, very apropos for the times we live in right now, because we are asking ourselves, many of us, are our freedoms going to be taken away from us? Are our freedoms going to be rolled back, or have they already been rolled back? Can we stand against it? Can we make a change? And I think all of these individuals show, yes, they were able to make a change. Even if they were just a lone, young, small girl in the worst of circumstances, they could make a change, and they did. I think that tells us, it reminds us really that we can too. And one more thing I want to just tack onto this is my research for this book really underscored for me how important outdoor spaces were and are to the ability for people to get to know themselves, to test themselves, to learn and to grow and to be brave. And for that reason, I think we really must protect our outdoor spaces and open access to them for everyone.
Absolutely. And I love the way you have that connection between when you think about the situation that these women were in at the time. And we look at our current situation. We think about sort of, what's at stake in the upcoming election. What are the rights that have been rolled back for women? And look at how those women persevered and how that can inspire women today. Because think about it, we are 100 years plus past what they were experiencing. We're in different circumstances, but still under some assault that definitely looks familiar. And the resiliency that they demonstrated is certainly something that, women today need to be thinking about as well. And also the resources and what the limitations may have been way back then, but think about what is available currently and how women can sort of tap into the resources and the energy and advocacy that can help us to ensure that hopefully we won't be having any additional rights for women and girls rolled back. So thank you. And I really hope that everyone takes advantage of making sure that they read this and other books that you have written, and also, how they can engage others in having these kinds of conversations as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Miles, for sharing your incredible insight, your knowledge, and your time. I know it's back to school at Harvard and you're very busy,
It is
so
indeed.
I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I want to remind everyone that the recording will be available on the AAUW website. I want to thank my AAUW team for your support in pulling all of this together for the webinar. And I encourage everyone who is attending the webinar to visit AAUW.org and learn more about, as I mentioned, learn more about our advocacy, learn more about what's at stake in the upcoming election, more about our upcoming professional opportunities. Our fellowships and grants are going to be launched next week, educational programming. We do have another webinar coming up next week that's going to be focusing on, or the week after, on higher ed compensation. So, there is a lot that we need to keep ourselves abreast of, and I hope that you'll take advantage of it. And of course, I want to thank our AAUW members for the support of our fellowships and grants that provided the opportunity for individual scholars and leaders like Dr. Tiya Miles to be able to do the incredible work that she has created. So, Dr. Miles, I'm going to give you the last word that you would like to give to our attendees.
Thank you so much, Gloria, Dr. Blackwell, for having me. Thanks everybody for being here. And I'm going to leave you with something that Harriet Tubman's brother said to her, which is go out and see the stars.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.